episode 13, Breaking the Seals. Today, I want to focus on Revelation chapter 6, where Yochanan, or John, is showing the opening of the first six seals. But before we look into that very important chapter, I want to spend a few minutes considering a toy, which I think most of us have actually played with as a child. It's the kaleidoscope. Everybody use those? Yeah. As you may remember, that toy consisted of a tube containing 3 mirrors and pieces of coloured glass whose reflection produced changing patterns when the tube was rotated. I'm drawing attention to the effect produced by the kaleidoscope as being similar to the visions that Yochanan saw throughout the book of Revelation. Looking for a moment at the structure of the kaleidoscope, we see that it has glass in a cylinder at one end with a contained number of small pieces of broken glass. The cardboard tube links the two ends together, and it contains 3 long mirrors precisely angled so that when we look through the peephole at the opposite end, the coloured glass pieces seem to make one or well-defined pattern of colours reflecting back through the mirrors. Now when the tube's rotated slightly, the pieces of glass form a new pattern. The more the tube is rotated, the more the pattern changes. Now, the important feature of the whole instrument is that the same pieces of glass all form those different patterns that we can observe, simply because the tube is being rotated. Now, I believe this closely relates to the visions seen by Yochanan throughout the book of Revelation. Each vision is slightly different from the one before, and each vision is reflecting the events that occurred in the throne room of the court of heaven. Just like the pieces of glass are constant, so are the entities whom Yochanan describes in chapter 4. Once Yochanan entered through the door into the heavenly court, he began describing those that remained constantly throughout all his changing visions. Their number never increased or decreased. The same entities remained in every part of the changing scene. But as the scene in each vision changed because of the actions carried out by those entities, Yochanan saw in each vision the result of the actions of each of those same entities. Now I believe from that analogy of the kaleidoscope that we can see that all the events that Yochanan was recording were a direct reflection of what was said and done by the entities in the heavenly court. So who or what were those entities that were like those pieces of cut glass in the kaleidoscope? They were the ones, firstly, the one seated on the central throne, surrounded by 4 living beings, and outside there was an outer circle of 24 elders, and of course the Lamb of God. They alone were the entities that made up the heavenly court scene. Now returning back to the book of Revelation, we saw in chapter 5 that Yeshua was the Lamb of God and was the only being in the whole of the universe who was worthy to take the scroll out of the hand of the one sitting on the throne. Hence, chapter 6 opens with Yochanan's words, "I watched as the Lamb broke the first of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living beings say with a thunderous voice, 'Go.'" So began the process of the opening of those 7 seals. But we must keep in mind that the opening of all 7 seals had to take place during the period that Yochanan was observing in the heavenly court. The period, as Yochanan said in chapter 1 verse 10, was the day of the Lord. That is, during the 1,000-year reign of Yeshua. So each of the 7 seals must be opened during that one day. Verse 1 of chapter 6, when Yeshua, as the Lamb, opened the first seal, It was the first of the 4 living beings who said in a thunderous voice, "Go." So did any of the entities leave the court or move from their places? No. Instead, in verse 2, Yochanan says, "I looked, and there in front was a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and was given a crown, and he rode off as a conqueror to conquer." Nothing is said about who the rider was or where he went, but it appears from the opening of the second seal that the conqueror was going out down to the earth. But the narrative gives no clue as to what he was conquering. All we can assume is that something had to do with Yeshua's future role as the conquering king. As Nebuchadnezzar's dream showed, it was the stone, not cut by human hands, that finally destroyed the statue as a complete unit. That, of course, was Yeshua. So, is the opening of the first seal showing that he was the one who will ultimately be the conqueror of all the nations of history? That seems to be the most likely outcome. So moving on to the opening of the second seal, we see in verses 3 and 4 that when he broke the second seal, I heard a second living being say, "Go," and another horse went out, a red one, and its rider was given power to take away peace from the earth and make people slaughter each other. He was given a great sword. Like the first horse, no specific details were given as to what the red horse was going to do. In fact, in verse 4, it implies that he will remove peace from all the earth's inhabitants. The result of peace being removed suggests that it would result in a period of total social breakdown, not only among warring nations, but also it would produce a much larger scale disorder, which would finally lead to worldwide anarchy. The present situation is changing daily, with ever-increasing lawlessness within what have been, in the past, stable democratic communities. The modern social decline has become much more apparent during the last decade, with a rapid increase in many forms of antisocial behaviour and unprecedented levels of comparatively petty community crime. The result has been an ever-increasing social instability everywhere. So moving on to verses 5 and 6, Yochanan says, "When he broke the third seal, I heard the third living being say, 'Go.' I looked, and there in front of me was a black horse, and its rider had in his hands a pair of scales. Then I heard what sounded like a voice from among the 4 living beings saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, 6 pounds of barley for the same price. But don't damage the oil or the wine." The rider of the black horse is carrying a pair of scales, which suggests that he is referring to the price of basic food staples. Wheat or bread, which is the nutritional basis of all the nations in the Western world, is said to have cost a day's wages, or 2 pounds, which is the approximate weight of 2 loaves of ordinary white bread. We are hearing constantly throughout the media that the cost of living is skyrocketing, particularly in the last few years. Rental accommodation is taking over 50% of many people's income, so that the cost of 2 loaves of bread is heading towards a day's wages, particularly for older people on fixed incomes such as superannuation. Verse 6 then speaks about 6 pounds of barley for the same price. Now in Scripture, barley was generally eaten only by the poorest of people. So clearly in the Western world we are heading into an ever-widening gap between the rich and the poor, which is of course the most important issue that's facing most people in the democratic world. The verse concludes with the words, but don't damage the oil and or the wine. This appears to be a subtle way of showing the widening gap between the rich and the poor, which fuels an ever-increasing discontent among the underprivileged people. While the poor of society can survive on the supply of basic bread, the rich can never be content without their oil and wine on their table. So remembering that it was the Lamb who was breaking the seals, and the four living beings are the ones who are saying, "Go." Does that mean that we are seeing in these verses the pressure upon society is actually being engendered by God himself? If we consider the words of Yochanan in Revelation chapter 17, verse 17, we see that God put it in their hearts to do what will fulfill his purpose. That is, to be of one mind, to give their kingdom to the beast until the words have accomplished their intent. So it's a sobering realization that it is God who is provoking the nations as to bring them face to face with the reality of what will finally occur when Yeshua opens that sixth seal. And moving on to the fourth seal, we read that when he broke the fourth, I heard a voice from the fourth living being say, once again, "Go." I looked, and there in front of me was a pallid, sickly-looking horse. Its rider's name was Death. By 11th of March 2020, more than 180,000 cases of COVID-19 virus had spread through 114 countries and had caused nearly 4,300 deaths. At that stage, the World Health Organization declared COVID to be a global pandemic. Never in history had there been such a widespread pandemic that had impacted such a large percentage of the world's population. Many plagues have occurred in many parts of the world during past history, but never before on a worldwide scale. That is primarily because of the rapid air travel that covers the whole globe, and that spread COVID so quickly that it became completely uncontrollable until most countries closed their borders and caused personal lockdown. Even with such drastic measures being taken, over 7 million people have actually died to date as a direct result of COVID-19. Even now, there are still over 705 million confirmed cases still active in 229 countries. Now those numbers have been published by what is known as Worldometer, which is an international team of developers, researchers and volunteers whose goal is to make world statistics available for a wide audience worldwide. They are recognized by most countries as being a reliable source of statistics. In verse 8, Yochanan concludes his portrayal of the events that occurred in the breaking of those four seals by saying, they, the four horsemen, were given authority to kill a quarter of the world's population by war, famine, plague, and wild animals of the earth. Now, I think we all understand who the first three were that caused such upheaval of the world's societies in recent times, but the wild animals of the earth is something that I yet do not understand. As those four living beings are seraphim, according to Yeshayahu, or Isaiah chapter 6 verse 2, it makes sense that each one was sending out his own angelic army under his control, all of whom were speaking and acting on behalf of the one who was seated on that throne in the center of the room. So we begin to see that the words of Revelation 17:17 are being applied. For God put it into their hearts to do what will fulfill his purpose, until God's words have accomplished their intent. In that verse, God is using the human forces to work with the beast to turn against the ideologies of the world. All we have seen throughout the opening of those first 4 seals appears to be happening during the early stages of Yochanan's vision of life in the heavenly court, which we are told, of course, occurred on the day of the Lord. Therefore, we must ask the question, when did the day of the Lord begin? In answering that question, we must first acknowledge that there has been a great deal of confusion among scholars and commentators throughout the world, throughout history, about when those 4 horsemen actually did appear. Yet Yochanan clearly said in his vision that it occurred in the day of the Lord. So when did the day of the Lord begin? Did it begin at some unspecified time between the ascension of Yeshua and the modern age? Surely Yeshua would not have left such an important question unanswered. If in his ministry he did speak about it, what did he say and when did he say it? And what would happen? I believe the answer lies in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In all 3, he was telling his Talmudim the answer to 3 questions about the future. In considering his response, I want to deal with the words that Yeshua spoke in the Gospel of Matthew, where, starting in chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, as Yeshua left the temple and was going away, his Talmudim came to him and drawing his attention to the buildings. But he answered them, "You see all these? Yes, I tell you, it'll be totally destroyed. Not a single stone will be left standing." Their response to those words was to ask 3 more important questions. Tell us, when are these things going to happen? What will be the sign that you are coming? How will we know that the Olam Hazar is ending? Yeshua answered all 3 questions by giving clear answers without using parables. But we need to consider carefully just what he was saying. Starting in verse 4, Yeshua warned his Talmudim that they would hear the noise of wars, both near and far, where he appears to have been speaking about the pending destruction of the Second Temple, which occurred, of course, 40 years later. Not only did he warn them about Israel's wars, but he also spoke about the nations fighting each other, and there would be many wars throughout the world, but there would also be many natural disasters in the form of famine and earthquake in one place after another. He also said that such things must happen, but the end is yet to come. Then, from verse 9 onwards, he brings his admonition back to a personal level by saying that they would be arrested, punished, even put to death because of him. Also, many would betray and hate each other on account of him, and false prophets would rise and mislead many, and the love of Torah would grow cold. All these things happened to not only his Talmudim, but also to the rest of his fellow Jews during the 1900 years that they spent in the Galut, that is, among the nations of the world. He said those words in chapter 24, verses 9 through 12, which we read this morning. Most of the persecution of the Jews has been engendered throughout these last 2,000 years, has been at the hands of the Christian church institutions, down through the ages, until the state of Israel was established in 1948, then the focus of anti-Semitism changed to trying to remove Israel as a re-established people in their ancient homeland. Hostility towards the Jews, whether they had accepted Yeshua or not, has been constant, because all Israel collectively represented the chosen people of God dwelling amidst the nations. But the irony has been that all the way through those 2,000 years, it has been the same Christian nations who claim to love the Messiah of Israel, who have claimed the sole rights over Eretz Israel and the Scriptures, albeit at the same time constantly rejecting the Torah of Moshe. Yeshua concluded his discourse with the words in verse 13, warning his Talmudim, if they held out to the end, either the end of their own life or collectively as a body, until the end of this age, they would be delivered. Yeshua finally concluded his discourse with his Talmudim by saying in verse 14 of chapter 24, and this good news about the kingdom will be announced throughout the world as a witness to all the goyim, all the nations. It is then that the end will come. Now those words have been taken by the world of Christendom to mean that they were responsible for fulfilling that mission. But when we consider how many changes were actually made to the foundational teachings of Yeshua and the blatant rejection of Torah, makes one question, was that really what Yeshua meant in verse 14? The alternative way of considering Yeshua's words in that verse is to see that his words would go out to the nations during the 1,000 years, would be a true witness to the goyim that Yeshua was and still is the true fulfillment of God's sovereign plan on earth. Only at the end of the 1,000 years of restoration will all mankind have heard the true message of Torah. Only then are those who are left over and be finally able to enter the kingdom of God. Returning now to Revelation chapter 6, we see that there are still 3 more seals to be opened. The 7th and last seal must wait until all things have been brought to finality following the 1,000 years of restoration. However, the seals 5 and 6 must be opened before the restorative reign of Yeshua can actually commence. So looking first at the 5th seal, we read there in chapter 6 verses 9 to 11, when the Lamb broke the 5th seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been put to death for proclaiming the word of God, that is, for bearing witness. They cried out with a loud voice, Sovereign Ruler, Kodesh, HaKodesh, the True One, how long will it be before you judge the peoples of living on earth and avenge our blood? Each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer, until the full number of their fellow servants should be reached. Here Yochanan is seeing the souls of the greater majority of Yeshua's Talmudim, who had been called and chosen through the Ruach HaKodesh, actually crying out to him to avenge their blood. They were the ones who had been killed for their faithful witness to Yeshua during their own lifetime. Those are most likely the ones whom Yochanan was speaking about back in chapter 5, verse 8, when the Lamb took the scroll from the hand of the one sitting in the central throne. That verse says, when he took the scroll, the 4 living beings and the 24 elders fell down in front of the Lamb. Each one held a harp and gold bowls filled with pieces of incense, which are prayers for God's people. So from the time the Lamb took hold of the scroll until he opens the 6th seal was an unspecified period, but it must coincide with the actions of the 4 horsemen in the first 4 seals. Assuming that understanding is correct, all those who have been killed because of their faithfulness to Yeshua somehow were aware that the Lamb had taken the scroll from the hand of the one sitting on the throne. So they wanted to know how long it would be before he would return to earth and take them as the long-awaited bride. But as verse 11 says, the time for the ingathering has not yet been reached. So each one of them had to be given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants had been reached. We see from those words that it was only to be a short time until the number was complete. But as Yeshua said more than once, no one will know the day nor the hour until he actually comes. Even Yeshua himself said in Luke chapter 12 verse 40, "You too be ready, for the Son of Man will come when you least expect him." Shaul also says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 verses 1 and 2, to those who were waiting in his time, "You have no need to have anything written to you, brothers, about the times and dates when this will happen, because you yourselves well know that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." Then in 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 8 through 10, Kepha shares how 1 day and 1,000 years are alike in relation to Yeshua. Then he concludes his discourse by saying in verse 10, "However, the day of the Lord again will come like a thief in the night. On that day in heavens will disappear with a roar, the elements will melt and disintegrate, and the earth and everything in them will be burned up." So if Kepha says that the earth is going to be burned up on the same day, we need to recognize that he is also speaking about the opening of the sixth seal. Remember, Kepha shared his words at least 30 or more years before Yochanan was given the revelation. So neither Shaul nor Kepha could be copying the words of Yochanan. So having worked through what Yeshua, Shaul and Kepha all said about that period between Yeshua's death and his return, still does not give us a definitive time as to when the day of the Lord begins. The answer to that question in itself is a big subject, which I believe is best answered through the book of Daniel, which is why we are considering both these books together. But the actual answer is not needed to understand Revelation chapter 6. So I will not be considering that answer today. The answer will come in a later episode. So moving on to the opening of the sixth seal. In Revelation chapter 6 verse 12, Yochanan says, "I watched as he broke the sixth seal." The opening of that sixth seal causes a complete destruction of the world system as we know it. The narrative lists 7 catastrophic events that will occur when the seal is opened. All 7 events will result from celestial upheaval that will impact the earth in a very violent way. The events that occur are in many ways similar to the plagues that Yahweh Eloheinu inflicted upon Egypt, where he said to Pharaoh, through Moshe, "Let my people go." Having read what happened then, many well-meaning people have encouraged others to store up all manner of life-supporting wares and food items, with the idea that they will somehow avoid being affected by the opening of that sixth seal. However, it is abundantly clear that when the sixth seal is opened, it will be impossible to escape the calamities that will impact the earth. The 7 events that are listed in the narrative include a great earthquake, the sun being turned black as sackcloth, the full moon becoming blood red, the stars falling from heaven, the sky receding like a scroll being rolled up. Every mountain is going to be moved from its place, and every island removed from its place. Now the vision Yochanan saw includes the words, "Then the earth's kings, the rulers, the generals, the rich and the mighty, indeed everyone, slave and free, hid himself in caves among the rocks in the mountains, and said to the mountains and the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of the one sitting on the throne, and from the fury of the Lamb. For the great day of their fury has come, and no one can stand." Clearly, there is no escape from what is going to occur, no matter how well prepared we might be. We can see from the second and third events that the catastrophe will be caused by the presence of a celestial object near the planet Earth that will disrupt and distort the whole surface of the planet. Many have tried to fit what will actually happen into normal events between the Earth and the Moon, but it is physically impossible for the sun to be totally dark, obscured from view, and at the same time for the moon to be blood red. Because a normal eclipse is caused by the moon passing between the earth and the sun. However, that type of eclipse can only occur at the time of the new moon. It never occurs at the time of a full moon. The second event that is totally impossible under normal conditions is for the full moon to be blood red when the sun is darkened, because the moon, when it is full, is always on the far side of the earth, away from the sun. So if the sun is darkened, the moon can't shine red. Hence there will need to be another celestial body in orbit around the earth at that time. Looking at scriptures for the answer, we find exactly the same events occurred on the day and the hour that Yeshua died on the stake. As Matthew says in chapter 27, verse 45, "From noon until 3 o'clock in the afternoon, all the land was covered with darkness." And then in verse 51, "At the moment Yeshua died, the paraket, or the curtain, in the temple was ripped in two from top to bottom. And there was an earthquake, and the rocks split apart. And everyone who was present at the stake reacted by saying he really was the Son of God." So what happened at that time is the same as what will happen at the time of the opening of that sixth seal. The only way that the sun can be made to remain dark for 3 hours is for a celestial body to be located between the earth and the sun for those full 3 hours. Why? Because at the time of Yeshua's death, on the 14th of Aviv in 30 CE, it was full moon. That meant that it could not be a normal eclipse. So to find an answer, we need to once again look to Revelation, this time to chapter 21, verses 15 and 16, where Yochanan was told by the angel who had a measuring rod, and he measured the new Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. And Yochanan records, "The angel speaking with me had the gold measuring rod, and with the rod he measured the city. At 1,500 miles, its length, width and height were all the same." Yochanan is told that the city was a cube, measuring 1,500 miles on each face. However, what he does not tell us is that every celestial body that travels through space, because of gravitational and other forces, presents itself as a sphere, just like the earth itself. Hence, the sphere that encircles the new Jerusalem is exactly the same diameter as the moon. So if the new Jerusalem was orbiting the earth at the time of Yeshua's death, makes perfect sense that that is what caused the 3 hours of darkness. And that same new Jerusalem will be orbiting the earth at the time of Yeshua's return. Remember also, Yeshua himself said in the Gospel of Yochanan, John chapter 14, verses 1 to 3, "Don't let yourselves be disturbed. Trust in God and trust in me. In my Father's house are many places to live, because I'm going there to prepare you a place. Since I'm going to prepare a place for you, I will return and take you with me, so that you'll always be with me." Yeshua ascended to prepare that place for us in his Father's house and promised to return to take us to that house. So it makes perfect sense. As he went there following his resurrection, so he will also take us there. So I believe it is also the place where Yochanan was taken in the vision, and the one seated on the central throne is also the Father of Yeshua, as we saw in last week's episode. Much more could be said about the opening of that 6th seal, but time does not permit. So in conclusion, we must see how just one chapter of Revelation, the world as we know it, will be totally transformed with the opening of that 6th seal. All 6 events appear to be destined to occur within the earlier part of the day of the Lord, and will culminate with the complete destruction of civilization as we know it today. However, as the opening of the 5th seal shows, those who have a part in that first resurrection will be lifted from the earth before the 6th seal is actually opened. So next week I will dive into chapter 7, where Yochanan is shown who will actually be included in that first resurrection, and also the ones who will be part of the second resurrection, and how the opening of the 6th seal appears to occur between those 2 events, the first and the second resurrection. So until next week, Shabbat Shalom.